Thank you so much for all of you joining us today. My name is Meagan Williams. I'm your facilitator, and I want to just cover a few things before we introduce our panelists and get going. First of all, I want to reassure you that the program is being recorded today. So we will share this video along with some resources in a follow-up email next week. So during this time together, we invite you to just join us, take what resonates, and don't worry about taking notes or remembering anything specific. You'll be able to refer back to this later. At the bottom panel of your Zoom screen, you can see a Q&A option available. We have a lot to get through, so we will likely not have a chance to get to those questions until right at the end of our time together. We do hope that through our conversation, we will actually address some of the questions that may come naturally. So if you can hold on to your questions until the end, that would be amazing. We will also do our best to answer any unmet questions in that follow-up email that I just mentioned. So I promise this won't be the last that you will see of us. And if you have more questions for us after the event, we are happy to connect with you. So I will introduce myself quickly. Again, my name is Meagan Williams. I am the Senior Media Associate here at Compassion and Choices. And I am also an end-of-life doula based in my home state of Oregon. I have completed my end-of-life doula training through both IAP Career College as well as Going with Grace. I am also a member of the National End-of-Life Doula Alliance, or NEDA, which you will hear that name again a few times over the next hour, and have received their proficiency badge. I joined CNC, Compassion Choices, as a volunteer in 2020 after using the free end-of-life toolkit with a client of mine. And then I joined as a staff member in spring of 2021, and now I get to support our work all over the country. This webinar actually started out as a Midwest event and has quickly turned into something national with more than 600 people registered. We are blown away. This won't be quite as intimate as we thought it would be, but we're going to aim to get you as much information as possible over the next hour, as well as some more resources. It's clear that this is a really important topic, and we're so lucky that we had three wonderful folks who've collaborated and volunteered with CNC that were willing to work with us and share their insight. I've also been dreaming about doing an event like this since it came to Compassion and Choices. So I want to thank the Midwest team for inviting me to work on this. This is really exciting. During our time together, we're going to cover a few things, and I want to make sure I let you know what those are, so you know what's coming. We're going to talk a little bit about the role and scope of an end-of-life doula. We're also going to talk about finding and connecting to an end-of-life doula, if that's something you're interested in for yourself or a loved one. We're also going to answer some common questions that we often get or that people are often curious about. And we'll also give you some more resources for your own family, community, for yourself, and also some ways to connect with our incredible panelists. So I actually want to do that part right now. So we're going to get going with introducing our wonderful panelists who have so much great stuff to share today. I'm just going to randomly pick your names based on where you are on my screen. I told you I would do that. So Ellonyia, can we start with you, please?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. My name is Ellonyia Yenney, and I own Of Grave Concern Doula Services. I'm in Bettendorf, Iowa, and I work with people in person as well as online. I earned an end-of-life doula and a companion animal end-of-life certificate from the University of Vermont College of Medicine. I'm a member of NEDA and have their proficiency designation. I'm also a member of ANELDA and have completed their training. And finally, I'm a hospice volunteer with my two therapy dogs, Lola and Tilly. I became interested in support at end of life about 20 years ago when I read The American Way of Death by Jessica Mitford. That sort of put me down the rabbit hole in terms of understanding how much people deferred to others regarding healthcare, funerals, and end of life, and frequently how uninformed people were about their available choices and rights that might be more in line with their priorities, values, and beliefs. So for example, before my training or during my training, I learned that 80% of people want to die at home, and yet 80% of people die elsewhere. And I really wanted to know where that disconnect was. And one was simply that people were not making their preferences known in a meaningful way. So while I provide all customary doula services, I really specialize in facilitating these tender conversations about death and dying. Now, I specifically don't want to call them difficult conversations because that's already kind of skewing how people approach them. So I provide avenues to have these conversations in ways that aren't scary. And this can be through mechanisms like card games and death cafes and answering specific questions involving what dying looks like, because it's less scary if we know what's typical. I also want to connect in ways that make sense for them. So for example, earlier this year, I was meeting with a woman and her 2 daughters, and we spoke at length regarding what an end-of-life doula was, and just as importantly, what they are not, and how I could support them. The daughter on my left was a school librarian and suddenly said, "Oh, so you're going to be our Sherpa. You're going to help navigate us over this mountain because you've been here before." And I thought that was just beautiful. And then I turned to the daughter on my right, and she was in business, and I could tell that didn't really seem right for her. So based on our conversations, I suggested that maybe she'd prefer to think of me as an end-of-life project manager, and that together we'd chart out what a good outcome would look like and how we could arrange to have the best chance of achieving that. And I knew when she immediately grabbed my hand that that's what made sense for her. So I know we're going to get into specific questions later this evening, but I just really wanted to, again, thank Compassion & Choice for hosting, as well as all of you for being here tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Ellonyia. I appreciate that. And yes, after we get done with the introductions, we're going to talk a little bit more about that actual role, but I love both of those mindsets. Thank you for sharing that. Nicole, can you share next?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Nicole Daigle, and I am an end-of-life doula based in Chicago, Illinois. I do in-person services primarily, but I'm also available for online when needed. I trained through the International Doula Life Movement, both for their doula training program initially, and then I went back to do a more in-depth training focusing in on advanced life planning to be a specialist in that area. So that's kind of the cornerstone of my practice. Ellonyia was talking about helping people have those conversations about their wishes and getting that all communicated. So I really wanted to help people get through some of that paperwork and the bureaucracy and those things that people can be really afraid of, and it can get confusing. So I wanted to wade in there and become an expert in all of that so that people didn't have to worry about it themselves, that they could have a guide. And I got to that part of my practice after I was witness to several of my close friends losing their parents, both through longer illnesses and also unexpectedly. And in various ways, wishes hadn't been expressed, and also people didn't realize different things that needed to be handled at the end of life, and that can feel very overwhelming, especially when you're working through grief at the same time. So when I was watching my friends go through that, I felt really helpless. And I realized as I learned about being a doula, oh, I can be someone who helps. I can get in there and I can help guide people at this time of major need, because losing a loved one is always going to be really difficult, but you can have a guide there too. And then for someone who is at the end of their life, that's such an amazing thing that you can do both for yourself and for your loved ones, is to have those conversations, get things written down, it's such peace of mind, both for you and for everyone that you love. And then after my training, I did also go and become a NIDA member and get the proficiency badge with them as well. And then I'm also a founding member of the Chicago Death Doula Collective. So we are we're getting our nonprofit status right now. We're a brand new organization all about education, talking about death in really positive, productive ways, and providing services.
Thank you, Nicole. And those of you in Chicago, will make sure to include information about the collective in our follow-up. Reverend Morgan Dixon, I would love to have you introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. I, like Nicole, am in the greater Chicagoland area and have actually not had any clients in Chicago, which has been kind of funny. They've all been online. Like Meagan, I trained with Going with Grace and Ellonyia Arthur and continued in that program and was a supporting student guide as well. And I came to this idea, didn't know what a death doula was. Certainly as a member, as a clergy person, was very familiar with death and had my own personal experiences with it and helping to shepherd parishioners and those that were under my care, but not on this side. It was until I had a personal experience up front, personal experience with a loved one who was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and had 33 days, and it was a whirlwind. And I wanted to then, I came to this afterwards and wanted to become the person that I would have wanted to have through that process. And so I have, that has been kind of the crux of what I've done, is to try to help people navigate, first of all, the big blow, and then to go from getting the diagnosis as to what's next, because it's, as many people can understand and probably relate, it's not easy to die. It's one of those things that's very complicated with all of the many details and many things to do. And so I have tried to fashion my practice, Death Light Doula, as one that helps navigate people through the journey. I am inspired by those who come through it, because to die is something that I think is very special. I am a volunteer with Vitas, and one of my favorite things to do is to be there at the last moment in the 12th, 11th hour vigil. And I've had a couple of patients to pass on my watch, which is a very special and spiritual thing for me. Happy to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for being here. And again, all of you that are joining us. We're going to dive into kind of talking about some of the nitty gritty, but before we do that, I wanted to give a quick overview of some of the language we're using. So we're talking about an end-of-life doula, and there are a lot of folks here who have varying experiences with that work. So I want to make sure to give some context. There are actually many terms used: end-of-life doula, death doula, end-of-life guide, death midwife. There's other variations, certainly. But each of these titles represents similar kinds of support, which is the holistic, non-medical support of a dying person and their loved ones, and a complement to medical and spiritual and community-based supports. End-of-life doulas serve as part of a comprehensive and knowledgeable care team. Some doulas may also offer themselves for public events just like this to demystify issues around death and dying, or do work around death education like Nicole spoke about. Some volunteer their services at no cost. Others have turned this into a full-time career. Some do it in person. Others offer this virtually. Many people find themselves naturally filling this role in their families without training or intention. Some of us actually did that first before knowing what the title was. It's also important to note that in cultures all across the globe for generations, this kind of knowledge and support has been present and is present in a lot of other places. Somebody in the community is always the go-to when it comes to death and dying. And though that's certainly not new, over the last 5 or 6 years in the US, there's been a renewed interest in this kind of care, and kind of a new generation of people have found inspiration in this work. So that's really what we're going to talk about. And again, we touched on the fact that there's a broad scope to this work, But that's going to be the first question I ask, which is, if you could speak, each of you, to some of kind of your focus areas in this work. And you all do plenty of other things, but each of you have kind of highlighted some things you're willing to talk about. Nicole, you shared with us a little bit about your extra studies that you've done around advanced care planning and also around legacy planning. Could you just, give a brief answer for us of what that entails?
Sure. Yeah, so when people hear end of life doula or death doula, they think people who are at the end of life. But one thing about advanced care plans is really anyone over the age of 18 should have their end of life plans. That's kind of the beauty of that part of the role is, I work with people really at all stages of life. And you kind of revisit those plans anytime you have a major life change, but then you have them in place so that should anything happen, then your wishes have been communicated. Hopefully you've had those conversations, but at the very least you have things written down. There's something to point to so that your loved ones know what you would want, both for end of life care and then what you might want after your death. So I help people know kind of what actual paperwork needs to be filled out. And then I will sit down with people and actually go through the paperwork, because some of the language can be confusing. And just they are, I like Ellonynia's wording, they are tender conversations to have, along with making those decisions and putting those wishes down. So I do like to use Compassion and Choices has wonderful tools that I do use in my practice. And I think I'm not the only one on this panel who does that. So one thing that they have is they have a values sheet that I'll use to start a conversation. That's a really great way to help focus your wishes, because that's how I frame a lot of my conversations, because it doesn't really make sense to sit down and go through your wishes and think through every possible hypothetical situation, especially if you're getting your wishes written down when you're younger, when you're really not expecting the end of your life to be anytime soon. What makes a lot of sense is thinking, what are my priorities? What are my values as far as my life and as far as what's really important to me? And then you continue to go back to that as you're thinking through what you would like, as far as what treatments you might receive, as far as how you're treated at the end of your life and for the end of your life care. And I feel like those lead to really meaningful conversations, and that helps things make a lot more sense to people. And then as far as legacy planning, that can be a whole lot of different things. Legacy in general, obviously, that's sort of what you do with your whole life, is the legacy you leave behind. I'm sure the Reverend could speak a lot more to that. But for projects and things, sometimes people like to leave something behind for their loved ones. It could be something as simple as writing some letters, and I can help people think about the sorts of things they might like to write. But it could also be, maybe they want to make a painting or a collage, or, just some sort of, do something with an artistic medium. And I can help people sort of think that out and plan that out. I was an elementary school teacher before. I like to do a lot of DIY arts and crafts. So I really like to work through that sort of thing with people. And that can just be a really beautiful thing for people to have after a loved one passes.
Thank you so much. And what again, a beautiful example of this holistic, like I said, holistic non-medical support that can start in a lot of different places. And for some people, the paperwork is a kind of natural place to start because it's really tangible. and maybe they already have an attorney, or, it's something they've already done. But sometimes having the more in-depth conversations about care in and of itself, things like that, can be really challenging. Ellonyia, can you speak a little bit to those tender conversations and some of the tools or things that you use to help facilitate some of those conversations that are, a little bit less black and white, right? A little bit less bureaucratic.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I will say is that, one, I don't view that it should be one conversation, because I think if it is one, you might be doing it wrong as well. The other thing too is, a lot of times it won't be the first time that you approach is probably not going to be that time that conversation happens, because people seem to kind of need to think about it themselves before either they're willing to be the ones to have the conversation, or they're willing to be the one who receives some of that information. So you really, once again, have to meet people where they are. And sometimes it takes a couple of times. But also, for example, like people entering hospice, one of the things that's kind of mentioned is that patients and families and doctors, they're all waiting for someone else to start this conversation, about entering hospice. End of life planning and things like that are very similar. Everyone seems to be waiting for someone else to do it, because talking about it is so taboo, or talking about it, is going to kill you or something. One of the other things that I think is really important is, there's some card games, which sound silly, but I think they've been really great. And we'll send these out as resources later, but there's a game called the Death Deck. There's one called Morbid Curiosity, and they're really great because they are games. But we would also say, if you want to have a conversation with someone versus just playing this game, and there's questions to answer, and you can get points and things like that, but you also can absolutely stack the deck. If there are specific cards and topics that you want to discuss, you can feel free to put those in there. But it's a way that people can laugh and talk about it, but you still end up opening that door. One of the other things that I think is so important is, a lot of times people will say, well, yeah, but my daughter knows what I want. And they leave it at that, which one is, I think, a horrible thing to do for a couple of reasons, because that puts all that burden on someone else without giving them any resources to know what to do. So a lot of times there's a game also called Go Wish, which is great because people then prioritize what they want at their end of life. So one of the things that I like to do, if someone is kind of delegating, if you will, to say, well, my daughter knows what I want, it's like, that's great. So let's have your daughter play as you. And then if your daughter doesn't get all of your priorities and wishes and desires down correctly, well, then obviously there's been a disconnect, and there's time now to have that conversation. Another thing to keep in mind, though, is some of these conversations, as Nicole mentioned, are different depending on where someone is in life. Sometimes people will want to, depending on the paperwork, just check a box that says, no, I don't want to be on a ventilator. And I understand that. But then you need to maybe pause and say, okay, what's the end that you're really wanting? Are you not wanting to be on a ventilator because this is at a time in your life when you have a prolonged chronic illness? Or do you not want to be on a ventilator when you're maybe young and healthy, but you've just had a very acute traumatic event? Those are totally different reasons for maybe why you would have certain health care versus not have others. So once again, it's all part of that conversation. And if you're in your local area, and we'll put this in the resources as well, but death cafes, which sounds horribly morbid, but they're just delightful. People get together and have coffee and pastries and just have all kinds of conversations about death. And it's not with any particular agenda or course of action that people are expected to go home and do. And they're honestly very lovely, lovely events. So I think I'll turn it over back to you, but I really look forward to seeing what other topics come up tonight.
Thank you so much. Yes. And like you said, we will send some of the names of those resources out. Reverend Dixon, we talked about that, you and I have talked privately, all of us have talked privately about that. spiritual aspects of end of life is not for everyone, but there's definitely elements of that and of community and of grief work that you have experience in. And I was hoping you could touch on some of that quickly for us.
I think, yes, I think I want to echo everything that has been shared tonight. I think it's wonderful. And I have found myself being the one who at dinner parties will throw out some of the taboo questions, and everyone looks back and be like, okay, so we're going to go there. But it keeps the conversation going to just ask, what do you want to do, and to not make assumptions about our final days, because death is certainly the only thing that we know for sure once we're born. But from a spiritual side, I think for those that have a faith community, it can be something that can help to lessen the burden if you have a spiritual connection, a spiritual church, synagogue, mosque, or whatever type of tradition you practice. But I think it's important to certainly bring in those traditions if you have them, but also know that there are other things that are available to you if you decide that the way that you want to live out your final days might go against what you have grown up doing. And that's okay too. But to know that there are choices in your last days. And there are also resources, and that you're not going through this alone. And I think that's what the biggest thing that people, when they seek out a faith community or some type of community to come together, they just want to know that they've been seen, that someone has borne witness to their being here, and that they're not doing whatever they're doing by themselves. And so there are resources that are available, certainly within different varying faith communities, but also that go work in tandem with medical practices. In a perfect world, the death doula is a part of the care team at the end of life. They're in the room with the doctors, your family. They're just another advocate there for the patient and or family. And certainly if they represent your faith tradition, all the better.
Thank you so much. And again, I think that it's just so beautiful that there's such a wide range of people offering this support who do have spiritual components to their practice or offerings, and others who don't at all. And it really does go to show that you can really find someone for you who aligns with those values for you. I did want to touch really quickly on, before we kind of jump to maybe how to go about finding someone like that, I wanted to quickly just mention, we often get asked, I'm sure all of you do too, but how does death doula get trained? Is that required? And so I want to make sure we're on time, but I want to just share quickly that there is no required certification, licensure, anything like that in the US or beyond. However, there are a few organizations that have kind of a board of established providers and end-of-life educators who've come together to create resources and create proficiency badges and things like that that are considered they're leaders in the work. One of those groups is NEDA that we mentioned, the National End-of-Life Doula Alliance. There's also INELDA, which is the international. And so a lot of those programs are run by trained and established doulas who also have additional certificates. They might also be members of the clergy. They might be registered nurses, funeral directors, lawyers. So there are experts in a wide variety of parts of this work. So it's important for people to know when they're seeking out doula services that there are a lot of people who do this work, who come from different backgrounds, which can make it a little overwhelming. And so in doing that, in trying to find someone, Reverend, would you talk a little bit about maybe when is it too early? Is it too early to start just finding a doula and saying, it might, it's one thing to fill out the advanced care planning paperwork, but what if I really want to have some of those more delicate conversations and I'm in my 30s or my 40s, or I'm not looking at the end of life right now?
I think ideally it would be great to have those conversations when you don't need them, or when you're not pressed against time, or when you're not dealing with anticipatory grief or all of those things that come when you're in crisis mode. So it's never too early, as was mentioned earlier, to kind of have ideas and even just be taking notes. if you're sitting with your parents, my parents are in their late 60s and early 70s, and we've been having just casual conversations, and I'll just take little notes and note little things, and then maybe we'll have a more pointed conversation later, just casually taking notes again. But it's never too early to have those conversations, because it's a lot easier to have them when you don't have to, and to talk very specifically, or to run different varied ideas about them, and to not make assumptions that your loved ones do know your wishes. It's good to put things in writing. It's great to put them in video. We live in a time of technology where you can record those things and save them. They'd be wonderful keepsakes and legacy things to share with generations to come. But I don't think there's ever a time too early or too soon to make plans.
Thank you. Ellonyia, can you speak a little bit to, honestly, people can be as simple as going to Google and typing in end of life doula plus my city or plus my state or whatever it is. But Ellonyia, Nicole, whomever, would you mind talking a little bit about some of the directories that also exist that people can try checking out?
Yeah, so I can go ahead and
watching each other's squares, sorry.
Both NETA, so the national, as well as INELDA for international, do have doula lists of people who have gone through their programs and have a certification through them. But once again, there are people who maybe are members of their organizations who haven't trained through them, and there have been people who have been doing the work for 30 and 40 years. So there's different reasons or qualifications that people might have, and some of it is just longevity of the work that they've already been doing. So while I think it's good to go out there and see some of those lists and resources, in no way do I want people to think that those are like the only qualified doulas in your area, because in my mind, that really just shows that these are people who are members of that group, which does have value, but there's other things maybe that people would also have value with.
Thank you. Such a great point. And I think it speaks to, again, what are your values? What's important to you in the support that you're seeking? So, excuse me, if you are somebody who it is really important to you that your end of life guide has received certain training that brings you comfort, great. If you're somebody whose biggest priority is physical location, how close are they to me, and do they have the supports that I need? Fantastic. Thank you. And Nicole, can you also, you said something really great last week about reaching out to your community. If you're interested in finding support at end of life, I think you said like, be bold with what you're requesting from your community. I don't know if you want to speak to that, but I think that was great.
Yeah, sure. Right. Kind of building on what Ellonyia was saying, right, it's just communicating what it is that you need and not being afraid to ask for it, because this is such a growing field, and there are so many people that are being drawn to this work that you should be able to find somebody who is a really good fit for you. Especially like, I'm in Chicago. We are in this process of building this collective that, we're really trying to be open to all doulas all around the city, anyone who wants to join us, with the goal of being able to connect anyone who is looking for a doula with any doula who's a good match for them. So if you have a request like, I need a queer friendly doula, put that in an email. We can match people with a queer friendly doula. If you need somebody who has experience working with XYZ, like put it out there. Don't be afraid to ask for anything that you need. And then I would say, I think I can probably speak for the other panelists from what we've spoken about before, but I always like to do a consultation with clients ahead of time and get to know people before we really start, diving into working together. So that's a time for the person that I'm going to be working with, but also for me, so it's both sides. So we can really see, are we a good fit? Is this the best for both of us? Because it's a relationship, it really should feel like it's a good fit on both sides. Because it is a really personal thing. This is a really important time. And I want to be there to make this an easier time. And if it's not a good fit, then that's not going to happen. And I want to help them find someone who is the right fit for them.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to jump around a little bit on our questions just because I realize they're flowing in a different order, which I love. So I'm going to follow it if you'll come with me. If let's say I'm somebody who is seeking an end-of-life doula, and perhaps I've Googled my area and found someone, perhaps it's a directory, perhaps I asked my barista and she happens to know someone, great, whatever it is. And a lot of folks, like you said, a lot of end-of-life guides do have, they'll do consultations for free. If I'm going to someone and I'm meeting with them, what are some of the questions I should be asking them to know if they're a good fit for me? And we can kind of round table that. So Ellonyia, do you want to start with maybe one or two questions and you can kind of popcorn off each other here for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, sorry about that. I think one of the biggest questions that I get asked is, like, what is the scope of your service? So what all do, because a lot of doulas do a lot of different things, but we do tend to kind of specialize in one thing or another. So it's are we able to fulfill all of their needs, or do we also need to then give them some other resources where they can either do other things on their own or be in contact with some other people? So knowing exactly what that doula happens to do.
Yeah, I think that's pretty great. The other thing is to know how frequent they can be in communication with you. And I think that's a not an initial conversation, but it's probably one that happens a little bit later on. And once you've decided to go ahead and work together, once you've determined that it is a good fit, that the services that you offer and the goals and the values that the client may have are a match, you can just say, well, can I contact you all hours of the day? Can I contact you just between 9 and 5? Or is there a particular medium that you would prefer? Is texting, email, phone calls? What's okay? Are we doing this in person or are we over Zoom? But to really just define the boundaries, because as we've mentioned tonight, it's a very delicate time and we want to be able to provide the best care, but we also want to be able to get to the immediacy of the care that's needed.
Mm.
Thank you.
And to piggyback off of that, when are you available for services? So, because that can be, services can happen at all times too. So, and how often are you going to be here? So that depends on your needs. Maybe you want someone to be there a couple of times a week. Maybe you want once a week. Maybe you want every day, so that's something to communicate. Some doulas have a minimum amount of hours at a time. Some don't, so that's something to discuss.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to jump in and say, just to tie in, because this is a big one, because if one of us doesn't provide the particular care that you're looking for, we know enough of other doulas in the area that we certainly can refer you to people. Nicole spoke to the collective in Chicago, and there's collectives and groups all over the country that will help pair you with someone who's a better fit for what your needs are.
Absolutely. And I was going to say that, any of us, again, it's a reiteration that any doula that you speak to should be able to help you find somebody that fits. And part of that is also pricing. That's a really common question. And so I want to make sure I just mention that pricing should be really clear. As I mentioned at the start, some doulas offer their services for free. Some have hourly rates. Some have kind of like you get me for 8 hours a week and this is how much, whatever it may be. So that should be really clear. And they should also have access to, or at least a referral of some kind to someone who has perhaps sliding scale services or who does offer free supports. So just because they don't offer that, no judgment, but they should be able to help you find someone else who can fit into your financial needs if that's a consideration. Also, backup associates is so huge for some of those same reasons. So you might not have a full collective, but do you know some other folks in the area? Or do you have some other people you trust that you could send me to? I'm not sure how often you all do that, but I assume a lot, because I know I do as well. If I don't have time or space to take someone on as a client. Thank you for all of that. I really appreciate that. I want to make sure we get a few minutes at the end for some of the questions that have come through, but I did want to also ask, or mention, somebody might also want to consider talking to their doula about comfort level or connection to medical teams, hospice teams, things like that. So I don't know if, I know a few of us have done hospice volunteer work. Ellonyia obviously has her therapy doggos as well. And that is something that is kind of differs by where you are and all of that stuff. But I think, Reverend, you mentioned kind of the dream, the goal is for doulas to really be a part of the entire team and to really be taking in information. Do any of you have some hospice experience that you'd like to share, or kind of that has worked really well that you'd like to see happen?
So one of the things I think I just kind of want to put out there too is that for people to understand that in no way is a doula here meant to be a replacement for hospice. We're not trying to kick anyone out the door. We're actually there to help support addition, because what a lot of times people don't understand is that hospice sometimes is a brick and mortar location, but many times it's there to support someone being in their home. But hospice does also not provide 24-hour round-the-clock care, which is something that a lot of people aren't aware of. So we're there to help support. We're help to kind of, as I said, kind of project manage, sometimes it's appropriate, in bringing those people together to have someone that can help coordinate the communication and care. But also I want to point out, in terms of dealing with hospice, and of course this can depend on where in the country you are, but you're allowed, and I would say you should be encouraged to interview hospices. It's not just that they refer you to one hospice and this is your only choice or option. You can find one that maybe fits better with your priorities, beliefs, and values, and to find out if the support that they could offer is maybe a better match for you. So I think we also have some of that in the resource, in terms of maybe some questions to ask hospice. But also, if you can go in and see some of the facilities, if it's a brick and mortar or if it's an assisted living facility, things like that, they do vary quite a bit. So I would really encourage people to not just hear one name of one facility. I would really encourage you to interview as much as possible.
And unfortunately, many times money is the factor that differentiates the level of care. And so if you can get an extra advocate, which would be your death doula or end of life guide, then they can help to translate some of all of the overwhelmingness of all of that.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, if you feel like having an end of life guide, if that support is really important to you, sharing that with a hospice that you might be interviewing with and finding out, have they worked with end of life doulas before? What's their comfort level? What kind of access, and can they be a part of that support team? It's a really great way to do that. And as Ellonyia said, some of these questions to ask someone that might be a potential doula will be part of the follow-up email that we do send. So we've kind of gotten to the end of our main questions, but now we're hitting Q&A time. So again, I think there were a couple other pieces that maybe we wanted to touch on that I think we got to, but we'll have plenty of stuff in the follow-up email for folks. But I do want to have a little bit of time here for some of these questions. We've got some really, really great ones in here, but there's a lot of them. So since we don't have a ton of time, I'm going to just pick a couple of them. those of you who we didn't get it, we will respond to you and we'll include this in a follow-up email. So we will get to these as much as we can, but I have a couple that I wanted to ask. This was a really, really great one, and actually probably one of the most common ones that I get is, how do you balance conflicting priorities of a client and like maybe their family members or loved ones? So I don't know if somebody has something they'd like to share about that.
I would say that can be very, very delicately. Certainly, if someone has retained your services from a financial perspective, you want to honor that commitment that you've made with them. But at the same time, you're there not to pick a side. We're not there to pick a side. We're there to make sure that everyone's needs are communicated and heard, at least. And then to try to act as an intermediary as needed. Everyone's emotions are oftentimes very high during this time. And so it's easy to not hear everyone. And so if you can be the sounding board and communicate those things, or try to anticipate any potential problems that might come up, or if there's a spirited family member that comes in that's always coming in a little more chaotically than others, maybe you attach yourself with them to try to help minimize their impact on the greater group, but to really anticipate the needs of what's going to happen there. That's a common thing, I would think, but it's something that is it's a delicate dance.
Yeah. And I'd say, kind of like Ellonyia was mentioning earlier, that it's ideally a series of conversations, not necessarily just one big talk. So if you can try and maybe start easing in with smaller, less controversial topics, find things that people can agree on, things that people can talk about that won't cause arguments and that sort of thing, and kind of get things rolling with, by introducing other things, then you can ease into things that might be a little more difficult. To you, Ellonyia.
Yeah, and one of the things I would say too, full disclosure here, everyone would like it to be different, but end of life is not a Hallmark movie. So everyone always seems to think that at the end, everyone will rally and it will be beautiful. And sometimes it is, and that's wonderful. But in general, people die as they live, and families interact as they did, but even more so, because you do have those emotions and that. So while everyone would like everything to be smooth at the end, just know that if a family was dysfunctional or had personality conflicts before, that's going to happen too at the end of life. Hopefully you could have those conversations and get through it, but I don't want anyone to think that it's all going to be sunshine and light at the end if it wasn't that way before. So just also maybe keep expectations appropriate for what's going on at the end of life.
And communication is so key in that, right? One of the beautiful parts of this role is that you're removed from the family, but you're trusted and you're able to be part of conversations with a clearer head without as much emotional engagement. And frankly, as we all know, and especially, Nicole was a teacher. I was a public school teacher before I did this work. And I think we can say at all ages, humans respond strangely in the face of fear. And so sometimes even a family that has had beautiful and open communication for a long time, sometimes that changes towards the end too. So the work really is about meeting people where they're at, open communication, and like you all talked about, really serving as a really strong, Reverend Dixon and I can speak to this in our training. Our teacher taught us to have a strong back and a soft front, and that really does feel like the core of the work, staying nice and strong but open at the same time, and that's part of our job, is to do that. Absolutely. Another question, I think we have time for one more before we're going to have to wrap up for good. We have a couple more minutes. Somebody I had it. Somebody mentioned, a few people mentioned, questions about working with someone with dementia, or perhaps someone who might be pursuing voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. And I want to say that those are really wonderful questions to include when you're meeting with a doula. Would you all say that that's true, that you all might also know? I know some doulas who specialize in working with folks who are living with dementia. I know some who specialize in voluntary stopping eating and drinking. So would you say that that's definitely, sharing bits of your plan, right, is really important, and sharing what you're experiencing is really important so that folks can know if they can really support you. Yeah. Just wanted to make sure I shared that. But there are some wonderful doulas who specialize in those things, which is just really incredible. And part of our job is to also kind of know what our boundaries are, right? So I have colleagues who perhaps lost a family member to a certain diagnosis. And so they're like, oh, I actually can't take clients who are living with that right now. And that's okay too. So please know that doulas might suggest you or recommend you to someone else for that reason as well. My gosh, a couple more have come through and I lost where I was. This is such a lovely question. I'll wrap up with this one. Somebody asked, how can non-doulas be involved with or support our work? What would you all say? What can the community at large do to support this work?
I would say to support it, to have these conversations. A lot of times the doulas are here because people aren't having these conversations, and so we kind of sometimes step in to help them. But also, a lot of times people hear about hospice and they say, oh, that'd be great, more people should volunteer through hospice. But they don't volunteer through hospice. So I would say that, a lot of organizations really could benefit from a lot of different types of volunteers, whether it's in the office or whether it's actually sitting with someone, as they're actively dying. There's lots of different ways that people can be involved and can help support. So I would actually just really suggest that people maybe look out into their communities for ways that they could do that.
Yeah, and in addition to just having those conversations, depending on where you are, keep an eye out for events like Ellonyia mentioned, death cafes a few different times. That's something that our collective, we put on death cafes usually every couple months. I know there are some other doulas and other groups that do them in the area as well. If you see that kind of thing happening, go. They're really amazing. You'll meet some new people. You'll have some really transformative conversations. I mean, I guess I'm promising a lot, but they always have been for me. So it might really change the way you think about things and give you some tools to then take on to talk to people that you know in your life.
Reverend Morgan, did you want to add anything?
I agree with all that has been said. I think it really kind of binds us in the human condition when we think about how to support other people in this time. Death and dying is not easy, but we all have to go through it. We all have lost people. And so to just be really open and compassionate as best we can. No pun intended in the compassionate choices conversation. But to really lead with love.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. There's more questions. I see all of them. I am going to copy all of those down, and we're going to do our best in the follow-up email that everyone gets, which will hopefully be towards the middle to end of next week. That'll go out to everyone who registered, and we'll do our best to, within that, answer any questions that went outstanding. So thank you all so much for this. I also want to take the opportunity, as I always do, to just remind folks that Compassion and Choices is funded almost exclusively by donors, and we're able to do this work because of donations of all amounts, which makes such a huge difference for us to continue to expand our work and ensure that everyone's priorities and values are met at the end of life, and to continue offering events where we bring in great speakers and talk about different elements of this experience. So if you're interested in donating, you can go to compassionandchoices.org/donate, or you can absolutely reply to me individually after I send the follow-up email. Again, the follow-up email is coming your way next week. I'll also include some list of upcoming events Compassion and Choices is hosting, including our Midwest Train the Advocate series, which we're bringing back very soon. So that will be Midwest only, but we have lots of other events happening across the country. And I just want to say thank you so much, Reverend Morgan and Nicole and Ellonyia, for being with me today and for doing this with me. This was so fun. And I'm just so honored that so many of you joined us today, because this is obviously such a needed topic, and we're so hopeful that you got some great information. Also, in the follow-up, we will make sure to include the contact information for these three incredible humans if you want to reach out and continue conversations with them or ask them any other questions. So I just want to say thank you, and see if any of you wanted to share a goodbye before we head out.
Great.
I'll just say happy holidays to everyone for whatever holidays you might be celebrating, and to try to share as much love as you can this season, and to know that those who are grieving grieve a little bit harder during this time of the year.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining us. Meagan, thank you so much for moderating here. Fellow panelists, it was so wonderful to meet you and get to know you a bit. And happy holidays and happy New Year to everybody.
Thank you, everyone, the panelists, especially. I really enjoyed speaking with you all, and Compassion & Choices for hosting us, because I was just very honored to be here. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to end the recording and end the webinar. Thank you so much.